Laboratory procedures are the core concept in the Laboratory Information Management System. They provide the basic information needed to identify and code the procedure, collect specimens, process tests, and bill for the procedure. Lab procedures can be ordered individually, or they can be combined to create lab panels. Defining lab procedures correctly and completely will lay a solid foundation for the rest of the Laboratory Information Management System. For this demonstration, we'll add a glucose test to our lab procedures and create a glucose tolerance panel. We'll start off by opening the Lab Procedures dialog. I've created a shortcut for it so we can access it easily. You can also navigate to it from the main menu bar. You might expect to find it in the LIMS menu, but it's not. The choices there focus on the day-to-day pharmacy tasks. Creating a procedure is one of those things that you'll invest time in during the initial setup, but after that you'll only need to make occasional updates. So you can find it by selecting List, Lab, Procedures. We'll begin with a quick look at the layout of this dialog. At the top we have our buttons to create, edit, and find procedures. We also have a button to create orders for our procedures. We'll take a look at that in a minute. The top grid displays a list of lab procedures that have been defined for this facility. These can be tests that are completed in-house, as well as tests that are sent to outside labs. You can see that by looking in the vendor name here. The middle section includes details about the highlighted procedure. Below that, we have a grid with the analytes to be tested. And the very bottom section displays any disclaimers associated with the lab. To get started, I'll click to create a new procedure and enter a name, abbreviation, and description. Then I'll select the lab procedure type. Opening the drop-down gives us a list of types that have already been used. If we need something that isn't in the list, we can use the three-dot button to open the dialog for that list. Double-clicking an entry will add it to our drop-down list. If the type we need isn't on the list, we can add it by clicking Create, entering a name and description. Clicking OK Close will save that and close the dialog. Here we see the new type is added to the drop-down list for us. Now I'll enter the link code, and if I wanted to associate a non-link code with this procedure, I could enter that here and the coding system here. I'll also select the billing service place. The three-dot button here lets you update the list just like we did for the lab procedure types. Next, you can decide when the procedure should be posted to billing. I'll change it to collected. We also need to choose the default vendor for this procedure. If the vendor is already in the list, we can select it, or we can open the dialog that manages our list of lab vendors. We'll cover the details of this dialog in another video, but things to remember here are that VersaSuite uses the lab vendor list to manage digital communication between the EHR and the labs. This includes your in-house lab, so we need to be sure to have that set up as a vendor. The other thing that's important here is that the vendor information can create a direct link to our accounting module to reduce the time you spend on bookkeeping and data entry. We'll assign this procedure to our in-house lab, which is already in the drop-down list, so I'll just close this dialog. Select it, and move on to entering a procedure code. A drop-down list wouldn't be practical here. If you already know the correct code, you can enter it directly, but I always recommend selecting it from the dialog to avoid typos. You can use the buttons on the toolbar, or you can take advantage of the built-in keyboard navigation. The Enter key will run your search and highlight the first result. To select it, all you need to do is hit the spacebar. That adds it to your list at the bottom. You can use the arrow keys to step through the entries and check any that apply. Or you can search a new term and continue adding to your list. Clicking OK Close adds those codes to the lab procedure. Select any allergies that might be triggered by this procedure, and add any instructions for this procedure. In this right-hand column, we can indicate if fasting is required for the procedure and the length of the fasting period. Next, we can enter information about the specimen, including its type, storage temperature, and how many labels to print for the specimen containers. For in-house labs, we'll also need to pick the instrument for the test. We have the ability here to define reflex procedures and lab procedure rules. Those are advanced topics that we'll cover in a separate video. We'll take a look at the Ask on Entry questions for lab procedures. Opening the lab dialog will show me a list of questions for this lab. We haven't entered any yet, so the list is empty. I'll click the button to edit the list, and click the Add button to add an entry. To search the questions that have already been saved, I'll click the binoculars. Double-clicking on one of these will let me add it to the question list. To create a new question, I can return to that dialog, click Create, enter a name, description, and the full text of the question as it should be asked. From the answer type, we can choose what kind of response to accept. Using a pick list can save providers and staff time and improve consistency. It'll take a little more work during the setup, but will be worth it in the long run. Clicking the three-dot button displays the pick lists that are available and how they're populated. Here we have a list with 4-hour blocks of time. There will be options in a drop-down list when the question is asked. If I had coding information that related to the question, I could add that here. This looks okay, so I'll go ahead and click OK Close. Here I can specify if this question should be asked when the order is entered or when the specimen is collected, and decide if the question should be optional or not. Our next step is to enter the list of analytes to be tested. When we click the Add button, we can either select an existing analyte or define a new one. We'll cover the specifics of that in another video. Now for the last step, you can enter any disclaimers as free text and save the procedure. Finally, now that the procedure has been saved, we can add an order for this procedure to the CPOE by clicking the Create Order button. So now let's go check our order definitions. Select the Lab tab, search for the procedure, and take a look at the details. The order can be edited to add details and directions as appropriate. Under the Type Specific tab, we see that the procedure we just created is selected. Notice that the lab orders can be for either individual orders or for lab panels. Let's go ahead and take a look now at how to build a lab panel from lab procedures. We could open the lab panel dialog with this three-dot button if we wanted to, or we can open it directly from the main menu bar. Let's do that instead. I'll close this and go to List, Lab, Panel. This shows us a list of existing lab panels. Clicking on a panel will display its details below. And to see the lab procedures in any of them, we can just click the plus button, or if we want to expand or collapse the entire list, we can use the buttons here. One trick that can come in handy is to search the list by choosing Find from the right-click menu. For example, I can test for panels with the hemoglobin procedure. Also notice that panels can contain other panels. For example, the cross-match panel includes the cardiac panel that's defined here. To build a new panel, I'll click Create. Before I can add anything to it, I have to give it a name and save it. Now I can populate it by clicking Edit, and here we have two lists to select from, one for panels and one for individual procedures. To add a panel, I can select the one I want and click Add Panel. The procedures are organized by type. I can either expand those and scroll to the procedure that I want, or right-click and find to search the list. And add it to the panel. Lab panel rules can be set up to trigger actions when the panel is ordered, or when its status changes. That's another advanced topic that we'll be covering later on. Add a link code, description, and disclaimer if appropriate, and update the record. Like the lab panel procedures, we can add an order for this panel to the CPOE by clicking Create Order Definition. That brings us to the end of this introduction to lab procedures. We've taken a look at the elements used to define a procedure and how that procedure can be used to build orders and lab panels. You should be able to create and edit basic lab procedures and understand the fundamentals of the lab module well enough to start learning about the more advanced features that will help you streamline and automate your workflow.